And conversate, I went back and forth. But look, this is the kind of thing I didn't want to get drawn into, which is every little exchange. You know, there are substantive conversation, meetings and conversations and negotiations, and that's not what I'm alluding to be clear.
When you go to Washington next week, will you bring up with him the pain that our sectors are currently facing and talk about re-engaging?
I'll bring up with him what I bring up with him when I see him. These are points I do make to him. My exchange with the president yesterday was not newsworthy.
Well, as Canada rolls out more support for sectors hit hardest by Trump tariffs, does that mean that nothing new is coming on the Canada-U.S. file? Well, that's the $50 billion question. That number, by the way, is what Prime Minister Mark Carney says tariffs and the uncertainty from the trade war have cost the economy so far. Right now, talks are paused. But as you heard in that clip, the Prime Minister and President are still talking. Now, he didn't say who cares, but he did kind of say NBD, no big deal. But we do know that Carney will see Trump in D.C. next week at the draw for the FIFA World Cup. So let's dig into the politics of that meeting with our front bench. I'm happy to introduce everybody's favorite political couple in this country. Yes, they are so close together that we can't keep them far enough apart. Sharon Carr, CTV News political analyst. She's a former deputy chief of staff to the former finance minister Bill Morneau. I did not know a hug was coming. Next to her is Sebastian Skamsky. He was the former director of media relations to conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. I love the smiles. We don't see enough of that. Jamie Ellerton is principal at Canaptis, and he worked for Minister Jason Kenney during the Harper government. Joining me in studio, Laura D'Angelo. She's with Enterprise Canada, and she previously worked in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office. Appreciate you all being here, despite Vashi not being here. We've talked about it during the commercial break, and I think we're all on a decent footing. And I'm going to try to start with Sharon, see whether or not I still have some of the Vashi magic here. How much of today's move do you think, Sharon, is an admission that the deal with the U.S. just isn't happening, and the fact that they had to do something for these two sectors?
I wouldn't say it's an admission. I think what we have to realize as a country is that we cannot rely on the U.S. to be a stable trading partner. So while these discussions and while actual North American free trade agreement is worked out in the coming months and year, we still have to do something for our sectors, and that's what we're seeing today, and that's what we saw Prime Minister Carney come out with. So I think what we need is immediate support for lumber and steel and a variety of other sectors that are getting impacted, and this was purely a way to address that. The conversations between Canada and U.S. will continue, but we have to stop relying on them, and this was a way to support the industries.
But Sebastian, I guess part of the question is, is this enough now? And does it give these industries enough time to pivot away from the U.S.? Because it feels to a lot of people, I think, like there won't be that deal anytime soon, and they've got to start to move on this now.
Well, I think that's one question. The other question, Mike, is how much does this bailout really give, how much time does this bailout give to Mark Carney? Mark Carney is really bailing himself out with this vast amount of money. He has, we've seen do that in his budget as well, with really no regard for spending or the inflation it will cause. But I think we need to hold Prime Minister Carney to account by his own metrics. He was the one who imposed a deadline on himself of July 21st, later to the beginning of August. And it is the end of November. It's almost Christmas, and nothing has moved. So while Prime Minister Carney may say that he doesn't care, obviously workers in the steel industry and the lumber industry, where, by the way, under Prime Minister Carney, the tariffs on Canadian lumber have tripled. He needs to buy himself time, and he's doing that with taxpayer money with this subsidy.
Laura, do you think that Carney is bailing himself out, and will this buy him a bit more time while he continues to try and get those talks restarted?
I don't think the Prime Minister is trying to bail himself out. I think, to Sharon's point, the Prime Minister can't just sit around and wait for Trump to change his mind based on whatever he's hearing. And so the Prime Minister is doing a few things here, right? These sectoral supports are to protect our industries, protect jobs, and he does have to do that, right? If he doesn't do that, we're looking at mills closing down, for example, in BC over the winter. It has to happen. But he's also trying to grow our economy in various ways. And we're seeing that in a couple of ways. He was just in the Middle East signing different trade deals, right? Like, he is growing our economy, diversifying our trading partners, while also to spur the domestic economy. He's using all of the tools in the toolkit. And so I don't think it's quite as, politically, as much of a political tool as Seb is trying to outline here. I think he is truly trying to do what is best for Canadians and for Canada's economy.
Jamie, how much of that is being properly explained to Canadians in your mind? I mean, what both Sharon and Laura are sort of sketching out is really trying to wean ourselves off of the United States as much as possible, because I don't think there's anybody on this panel that would disagree how heavily dependent Canada was on the U.S. But do you think that he's communicating that in a way that, Canadians can, A, get behind, and B, that people understand that it's not going to happen overnight either?
Yeah, I think there's a few things happening here, Mike. I think if you are working or somehow related to the steel industry, today's message is going to land with you. When you see economic hardship and economic shocks in this country, it's quite now become commonplace to see government support workers as a bridge to get them to more stability, whether that was the global financial crisis in 2008, obviously the world shutting down with COVID, and now the result of U.S. instability and the tariffs and kind of what that's doing for our economy. So if you're impacted by steel and lumber, you're hearing this, the fact that you get to continue to go to work while the Prime Minister is essentially providing financing to give these companies a bridge to whatever a new normal is going to be, I think they're going to hear this message. When you think of Canadians writ large who don't have direct exposure to lumber and steel, I think the broader debate continues to become, what is Canada's future, who's best to deal with Donald Trump, and how do we kind of realize what Sharon's talking about in terms of creating a new economic normal for Canada. And I think how that lands and that debate is very much still up for grabs.
Yeah, Sharon, why is it up for grabs? Why do you think that this Prime Minister maybe has not done a good enough job, in some people's opinions, of trying to communicate that?
Well, I would say it's not something that's super easy to communicate to Canadians as a whole. A lot of folks don't necessarily understand the nuance of what a trade war can do to day-to-day lives as well, and what that means for industry. So I think what the government and the Prime Minister and ministers have to do is a bit of a better job at communicating how these types of reliefs will potentially kind of have a downward effect on everybody in terms of helping them. So it is a communications issue, but also at the same time, we live in a political world and it's political rhetoric. I think most industry, we saw two individuals, both from steel and lumber associations that were on the show just before this, who were for the most part welcoming today's announcement in terms of what it means for their industry. So I think for the most part, if you talk to the business community, if you talk to the sector, they welcome this. But again, people still are concerned about what does this mean for Canada-US and for future trade negotiations.
Yeah, and Sebastian, I think, that is kind of the opening that Pierre Poilievre continues to drive through, right? And to sort of say, okay, what does this mean for, the person who lives on to say Main Street in, any town, Canada? Is that where he's going to continue to go if the Liberals have not made that explanation yet as to how it does sort of affect everyday Canadians?
Well, listen, Mike, I don't know that communication really is the struggle here for the average Canadian. Frankly, hot air from the Prime Minister or his ministers doesn't put food on the table or a roof over their heads. The challenge is, I think, quite simple, where Mr. Carney had declared to Canadians that he would be the only one that could solve this crisis with President Trump. That is what he sold Canadians. He didn't tell Canadians that we're going to subsidize our way out of this and overtax for the future generation just to get by right now. This is unsustainable. I think Mr. Poilievre has pointed that out today. And on top of it, it is not what Prime Minister Carney sold himself as. So I think Mr. Poilievre is going to continue to hammer on that. He's going to make the point that Canadians have been sold a bill of goods, and it's not really coming to fruition.
Yeah, okay. We're going to take a quick commercial break because maybe, to the point that the panel's making, maybe, trying to sell tariffs isn't that sort of sexy object that governments try and do. It can be difficult to talk about how it does actually get down to everyday Canadians. But hey, this panel does a great job of it, right?